seminar. We have organized a couple of seminars during this year. It's forskarnätverk who is responsible for that, which is a small group focusing on research, and we thought that these seminars would be really good to communicate the research to everyone who's interested, focusing on sexual politics or sexuality. And I'm very happy that Nadine is here today because she's a guest researcher from South Africa who is now doing her PhD, soon finishing her PhD, and has been working for 2 years in Uppsala at the Center for Gender Studies. And my name is Jessica, for those of you who don't know me. And if you're interested to get to know more of what's happening, please let me know. And if you're not included on the Facebook group, I will include you there. Or if you're not on Facebook, just give me your email so I can communicate to you, because I'm the one who is organizing these events. And also, if you're not a member of RFSU, we always encourage people to become one. And I think it can maybe be interesting to take a quick round of the name and special interest or what brought you here, and then you can also give a short brief on who you are. Yes, so we will start here.
Okay, my name is Marie, and the main reason why I came here today is actually that I'm studying to be a media teacher, and in that mediated representations are interesting for me in that context, but I also have a background in gender studies.
My name is Lisa, and I'm currently a master's student in social anthropology at Stockholm University. And I saw this event flash on my Facebook, and I just thought it would be interesting to attend. I'm somewhat active in RFSU, so.
My name is Lisa, and it's Lisa who brought me here. I'm not yet a member in RFSU, but I will be by the end of this day, I think. I hope. And I study at Stockholm University, a bachelor in ethnology. So, and I have studied a bit with like sexual, what is it called?
The culture of sexuality.
Yeah, so before. And I find this topic really interesting, so yeah.
Hi, my name is Elise. I'm studying at Stockholm University, doing my first year in the social work program. And I've been to one of these seminars before, last year, so I haven't gone to one this year, and it just flashed up on my Facebook, and I thought it would be interesting. I'm interested in any issues that has to do with sexuality in general. So.
My name is Hassan Nasrallah. I work here at RFSU as a sexologist, and I have a long experience with the work with sexual violence, and I have worked at RFSU in 7 years before, and I'm really interested about these questions.
Yes, and as you might have figured out, I'm working at RFSU at the communications.
Yeah, thank you everyone, and welcome this evening. Thanks a lot for joining for this talk as well, and thank you for the introduction, Jessica. So as Jessica said, I've been in Sweden now at Uppsala University for just on 21, going on 22 months. And I'm almost heading back to South Africa in less than 3 weeks, actually. And the time has just gone really fast. So I was awarded a 22-month scholarship to come and complete my PhD in Sweden. And one of the reasons that I decided to come to Uppsala University was the fact that the Centre for Gender Research at Uppsala University has quite a strong background in cultural and gender studies as well. And so my supervisors have assisted me in this project, and I'll give you a bit of a background in terms of what it focuses on as well. So today's topic is mediated representations of corrective rape and Black lesbian sexuality. And what I'm going to discuss today is defining corrective rape. What is corrective rape? And also looking at the way in which it has been represented in South African newspaper texts. And so specifically what my project then focuses on, now I'll just give you a bit of an outline of the PhD project. I decided to focus on newspaper texts as well as literature and the visual component of looking at representations of Black lesbian sexuality and corrective rape in South Africa. Many of the studies that you will come across in South Africa have focused on reporting on corrective rape as a social phenomenon. So trying to find out, for instance, you know, why are Black lesbian women being victimized because of their sexuality. But the focus which has been applied in many of these studies often reproduces the idea that Black lesbian women are a homogeneous group in their representation, that most Black lesbian women are butch in orientation, that this is the identity, the foremost identity which is represented, and that it is this gender non-conforming identity which also at the same time makes them victims of violence and homophobia. So for me, I think that it will firstly be important just to give a definition of corrective rape and more or less when it started being used as well. So corrective rape, if you look into definitions thereof, many scholars have defined it as rape, which is perpetrated by heterosexual men against lesbian women in order to correct or cure their so-called unnatural or deviant sexuality. So this this became prominent, started to become more prominently used in 2003 with the first reporting of corrective rape in a South African newspaper article, The Independent, on Saturday. And at this stage, there were a number of non-profit organizations that were working particularly, non-profit organizations that were responding to the problem of homophobia and hate crimes, targeting particularly Black lesbian women and transgender men in South Africa. So the idea was that any gender non-conforming behavior was being met with a backlash, and that there was a type of disciplining or correcting of sexuality taking place at this time. Reports, if you look, I mean, I have focused on newspaper representations of corrective rape, and when I did a search, when I did an initial search, I used a database called SavvyNet. And SavvyNet has, through the database SavvyNet, you can access an online news archive with over an online news archive and news clippings which have over 40 major publications reporting on issues in South Africa, and so I used SA Media to look at to source articles on this, and I used the period 2003 to 2014. So the first newspaper articles appeared in November 2003, and the reporting period immediately yielded 221 articles that were reporting on corrective rape. 189 of these newspaper articles reported directly on the incidence of corrective rape in South Africa. Right, so another thing which has been interesting in terms of this study is the history of South Africa, looking at the period before the end of apartheid and the representation of black lesbian women during that time. One can barely find anything on black lesbian women. So what we see happening with a more liberal constitution from 1994 onwards, and with a constitution that focuses on sexual orientation and a progressive constitution that starts to accept same-sex relationships, is that this is met with a very big backlash. So the first type of visible representation of black lesbians is one of unnatural sexuality. So as soon as black lesbian women start to enter into public discourses, it's an image of a woman who's gender non-conforming, and also of one who's not accepted within the post-apartheid South African context. Right, so immediately there's a type of backlash there. It's important to give a little bit of context as well, also in terms of the interest of this study. In 1996, South Africa adopted a very liberal constitution. It was the first constitution in the world to include a clause that stated that no discrimination may happen based on sexual orientation, and it was one of the first 5 countries in the world to legalize same-sex marriage. This happened in 2006. One also sees that between the period of 1996 and 2006, that there are really major legal advances that are made for same-sex couples in South Africa. So we see simultaneously a very progressive legislation developing around same-sex sexuality, but on the other hand, we see a defining of lesbian sexuality and other gay and other sexual minorities. We see definitions emerging of LGBT people being defined as unnatural or un-African. And this is something which has emerged particularly within the South African context as well. So we see that there's been a lot of the public discourse, and in newspaper reporting as well, is this notion that homosexuality is not African, that it's something that has been imported from the West. And so we see a polarized type of perspective in terms of how the West perceives same-sex sexuality and how it's perceived within Africa. However, South Africa, with its progressive legislation, is seen as quite exceptional in this regard. So, although the rest of Africa is still criminalizing same-sex relationships, and there are even prison sentences reserved for people who identify as gay, South Africa is seen as still trying to uphold the constitution to a certain degree. All right, so that is one of the key points of interest for me, has been how can one speak about the representation of black lesbian sexuality in South Africa, which has emerged, and black lesbian women have emerged in South African newspaper texts as a particularly vulnerable minority. Where does that discourse come from? Why are they seen as particularly vulnerable? And what does this do, and how does this speak to power relations in the country and gender, and what does it say about gender inequality as well? Right, so as I mentioned, the period of analysis when I used the search terms corrective, curative, rape, and lesbian, SA Media yielded 221 articles, of which I used 189 of these articles. The representation of Black lesbian women and defining corrective rape has been central to the analysis. And within looking at newspaper articles, some of the questions which I asked has been related to who speaks, who has been silenced, and who has agency. So, for instance, how are Black lesbian women being represented in relation to the perpetrators of corrective rape? How are Black lesbians emerging at first in newspaper discourse? Are they speaking about the violence which is being enacted against them, or are they being silent? What is particularly being focused on between the years 2003 and 2014? And so what one starts to see in mediated representations or in newspaper discourse is that there's a particular focus on the violence which surrounds Black lesbian sexuality, as well as there seems to be a focus on the spectacular nature of violence and representing Black lesbians as tortured or violated bodies. In some of the theory that I've used, for instance, I draw quite a bit from Judith Butler's text on Frames of War, and how Black lesbians, for instance, fall outside of the frames of recognition of what is allowed to become livable and what is grievable. And I think that Butler's text is really central to this analysis in terms of the way in which Black lesbian bodies become defined. Right, so I'm going to go through the paper that I'm going to read through some of the most important things which I've identified in what this chapter focused particularly on a historical overview of the developments and the debates that emerged between 2003 and 2014. This has not really been debated or discussed before. Such a long period of analysis has not been covered, and using newspaper text has been really useful in that regard. And then the questions around, the questions concerning are Black lesbian women speaking? Are they being silenced? Do they have agency? These questions inform a later on thematic analysis, and I'm going to be addressing that as well in this paper today. Right, so as I mentioned before, the first newspaper that reported on corrective rape was The Independent on Saturday, and this was in November 2003. The article's headline is Gay Woman Hate Crimes, Scourge of Corrective Rape. And what we see in this newspaper article is that a number of lesbian women, Black lesbian women and transgender men start to come forward and report something which has been happening, homophobia and hate crime, but particularly corrective rape, which is seen as a disciplinary measure acted against them and their sexuality. So at this stage, one of the organizations that were responding to the violence was, for instance, the Rose as Thorns campaign. We also see the Durban Gay and Lesbian Community Center, and the founders of that organization, Mkize, says that what appears to be happening is that there's a direct backlash against women who are gender non-conforming. At this stage, one of the women who is working for the Rose as Thorns campaign and Behind the Mask, an online publication, Zanele Mawoli, is provided with the opportunity to interview 47 lesbian women and transgender men who have been targeted because of their sexuality. So Zanele Moholi also comes into my project at a later stage as well, because she has produced one of the biggest bodies of photographic work on Black, lesbian and transgender men on the African continent and beyond. It's reached both a local and an international audience, and it's been very instrumental in terms of mapping the problem of corrective rape, homophobia and hate crime in South Africa. So, so the news report foregrounds that women who do not conform to prescriptive African standards of femininity are the primary targets of corrective rape. Gender inequality and cases of gender-based violence become increasingly visible in the 2000s, and political leaders such as the country's president, Jacob Zuma, who remains the country's president right now, is reported on upholding misogynist and sexist views that contribute to the normalization of sexual violence in the country. In 2006 as well, some of you may have, I'm not sure if any of you would have heard of the case, but there was a bisexual identified woman, Kwezi, who took Jacob Zuma to court for raping her. And it was really instrumental to showing how gender inequality is still so rife in South Africa, because Kwezi was completely victimized for taking somebody of such stature and power to court, and she was really represented as a villainess in relation to Jacob Zuma in this regard. Even the ANC Women's League, which is more affiliated with the current ruling party, the African National Congress, was supportive of Jacob Zuma and not supportive of Kwezi in this regard. So, and we also see that the responsibility to provide information on corrective rapes at this stage is often caught up by human rights and research organizations such as the South African Human Rights Commission and Action Aid. And these organizations, as well as activists working with victims of violence, draw attention to the fact that there is no official recording mechanism for corrective rapes. So this has been one of the big problems in terms of visibility of the crimes and also visibility of Black lesbian women, is that while there are regular mechanisms to record rape, there hasn't been an official recording mechanism for hate crimes. And this is what activists and organizations started to call for, is that we need to implement a recording mechanism which will count and can be reflective of how big the problem of hate crime against LGBT minorities are in the country. Right, so the only known cases are therefore those that are reported on in the South African media, which are usually the most brutal and violent examples. Some of the widely publicized cases reported in this period include the murder of 18-year-old Zoliswa Nkonyana in 2006. Nkonyana was murdered for her sexuality in 2006. The trial only started 2 years later and was only finalized in 2012. A well-known South African soccer player, Yudi Simelane, was raped and murdered in 2008. Simelane's more prominent stature seemed to have gained more public attention, and the trial was also resolved in a shorter period of 2 years. However, some of the newspapers report on the fact that 2 of the accused were sentenced a long period, 18 years, but 2 of the accused walked free. And one of the survivors of corrective rape, who was actually brave and bold enough to speak about the corrective rape incident, is Millicent Geiker, and this happened in 2010. Millicent Geiker, after going public about the rape, the corrective rape, which happened to her, suffered severe psychological trauma and was really in the focus on the violence and the brutalization of her body actually seemed to be more negative for her speaking out. Right. At this stage as well, there's a very prominent organization that emerges. It's an organization in Cape Town called Luleki Sizwe. It's a Cape Town-based organization that featured regularly in this period for its active role in fighting hate crimes in South African townships. The role played by the organization's leader, Ndumi Funda, was central to gaining global attention for the problem of corrective rape. Funda was able to also get the South African Justice Department's attention by getting more than 100,000 signatures from more than 163 countries, which demanded that action be taken against homophobic violence. Newspapers report on a surge of corrective rapes in 2011, and Funda said that 510 women report being the victims of corrective rape every year, and that 31 lesbians have already been murdered. The statistics around 510 women who report being the victims of corrective rape every year has not been confirmed by any source, but what is definitely known is that 31 lesbians have already been murdered because of their sexuality. Up to this stage and up to this date, there's still no official recording mechanism. And although the Department of Justice and Constitutional Development committed itself in 2011 to implement or to establish a task team that would focus specifically on hate crimes, the bill has only been signed in now in September 2016. So this very delayed and ambivalent response to hate crimes against the LGBT community also sends a message of disinterest and also homophobia in relation to lesbian and gay sexuality in South Africa. It's also important to realize that corrective rape, although this is the focus of my talk, that it happens within a much broader context of gender-based violence in South Africa. For instance, many of the scholars that have been focusing on gender-based violence and rape in South Africa have defined the problem as a rape crisis. Simidile Dosakun in 2007 defined the problem as a rape crisis, and somebody by the name of Pumla Dineo Kola, a South African academic and writer, recently wrote a book titled Rape, a South African Nightmare, which has been really insightful for me in terms of a way of understanding this rape, of what she terms as a rape culture in South Africa. And Pumla Kola was also very active in an organization known as, with the name the 1 in 9 campaign. And the 1 in 9 campaign was established in 2006 at the same time as the Jacob Zuma rape trial. And the 1 in 9 campaign was established in solidarity with women who speak out against violence concerning rape and sexual violence in their lives. So for instance, just to give you a bit of an idea, in the 2013-2014 period, 46,253 rapes were reported in South Africa. In the 2014-2015 period, 43,199 rapes were reported. However, between 2011 and 2014, it was reported that there was a 21% decrease in the number of people reporting rapes because of the secondary victimization which takes place when reporting these crimes at police stations. So so even if the statistics seem lower in the 2014-2015 period, this is not necessarily a good thing. The 1 in 9 campaign, the name also came about and was taken from a report which was written by the South African Medical Research Council. One of the prominent researchers there, Rachel Jukes, and Lisa Vetten identified that only 1 in 9 rapes are reported in South Africa. So this is just, I mean, this gives you an indication of how prevalent rape is in South African society. Right, so with the 2003 to 2010 period, we can see that some of the debates were formative in defining what is corrective rape, how are black lesbians being defined in media discourses, the fact that they are being seen as a particularly vulnerable group, and who are some of the most responsible in terms of responding to the problem. Between 2011 and 2014, in 2011, the most prominent corrective rape cases reported on include the rape and murder of somebody by the name of Noxolo Nogwaza, whose body is found in a stream near a township called Kwatema. Also the rape of a 13-year-old girl from Appridgeville in Pretoria, and the stabbing of a lesbian, Noxolo Nkosana. Although rapes and murders are reported, the ANC, although rapes are reported, the ANC government remains silent, and activists voice their skepticism over government's commitment to establish a national task team on corrective rape. Other frustrations reported on include police and government's slow response to responding to and solving hate crimes, the unabated violence, government silence, and dehumanizing crimes reveal how the rights of black lesbians are not considered important in South Africa. In 2011 and 2014, we see a focus on the division of rights along race and sex lines, and South Africa's ambivalent stance toward homosexuality, where the government remains silent. In 2012, newspapers reported on a homophobic statement made by the Zulu monarch, King Goodwill Zwelithini, who claimed that same-sex relationships were rotten. This echoes the South African president's earlier statement that same-sex marriages are a disgrace to the nation and to God. News reporting shows how there are oppositional ideas regarding the treatment of homosexuals in South Africa. On the one hand, we find that there are very traditional discourses that are emerging around homosexuality. So, for instance, the idea that homosexuality is un-African, un-Christian, and unnatural. So, a particular part of society which is defining itself as essentially African, while on the other hand, we have a minority of voices, activists, gay and lesbian activists, as well as human rights organizations which are fighting for the rights of the LGBT community, and also trying to uphold the South African Constitution. In 2013, newspaper reporting features more on articles which focus on the intersection between homophobic and xenophobic attitudes in South Africa, and the failure to create a sense of national cohesion. An important article which emerged in this time was written by an asylum seeker from Kinshasa. Junior Mayema defines South Africans as intolerant of difference. Some of the common issues faced by asylum seekers reported in this article include the corrective rapes of black lesbians. So even people who are seeking asylum in South Africa are also being the victims of corrective right? Another issue which Junior Mayema highlights is the fact that transgender people have a lot of difficulty in trying to get identity documents and also xenophobic discrimination. So for an asylum seeker coming to South Africa, which he or she may deem as more liberal in terms of sexual rights, they find a very different reality often when arriving in the country. And not only is there homophobic discrimination, there has been a lot of racialized and xenophobic discrimination as well. Right, so according to Funeka Soldat, who is a lesbian activist from the organization Free Gender in Cape Town, attitudes toward lesbian women have not really changed over the last 20 years. 2013 also focuses on the different struggles faced by the Black and white community, where the Black LGBT community are framed as struggling alone against discrimination and violence. This also becomes particularly prominent in newspaper articles which report on pride events in South Africa. For instance, in 2012, there was something called a die-in protest, where one can see that the rights of the white LGBT community within, for instance, a pride celebration is one of white privilege. So while a celebration is represented in terms of pride at that particular period, many of the Black LGBT community members are facing problems of corrective rape, homophobia and hate crime, which is not particular to the white community. The Die-In protest in 2012, which was supported by the 1 in 9 campaign, and which had members of the 1 in 9 campaign present, was an act by the LGBT community to stand in front of the protest and to lie down in the street and to say it is important to stop and realize the lives that are being lost due to homophobia, and making an explicit statement against what is happening. At this Die-In protest, however, we see more of a critical stance taken by the white LGBT community, saying that this is supposed to be more of a celebration instead of in solidarity, standing together with the Black LGBT community. So once again, the Black LGBT community is seen as standing alone in terms of fighting discrimination. Newsworthy topics in 2014 include debates on South Africa's silence on Uganda and Nigeria's anti-homosexuality laws, and the normative nature of homophobic attitudes which are defended by African culture. Christy van der Westhuizen, an academic and writer, describes how heteronormative notions of race and sex define who draws sexual and political currency in the country. She convincingly argues that racialized and sexualized political power allows leaders such as Jacob Zuma and the Zulu monarch to espouse sexist and homophobic sentiments because of their identification as authentically Black or African. South Africa is framed as either openly homophobic or ambivalent concerning the rights of sexual minorities, with lesbians left vulnerable to discrimination. Three broad themes that emerged when analyzing these newspaper articles was responsibility, visibility, and national belonging. Right, so I think that I'm maybe going to stop there for now, and so that we can discuss it, and perhaps then I can also speak to you within the discussion some of the themes that emerge, and also looking at the thematic analysis which I covered in this chapter. Yeah, this is part of a larger project. I just want to say this as well. that this seems like a very negative representation of LGBT rights in South Africa. But it's important to state that while there have been major setbacks, there have also been major gains for the LGBT community. In addition to this, what I focus on in the PhD project is looking at literary or post-apartheid lesbian literature as well, to give a more textured account of the lives of Black lesbian women. For instance, one sees alternative types of identification emerging with traditional healers, Black lesbian traditional healers in South Africa, that are defining their identity in very different ways. Using certain, for instance, there was a woman by the name of Zandile Nkabinde. She has written an autobiography on her life called Black Bull Ancestors and Me, My Life as a Lesbian Sangoma. And Nkabinde, who identifies as a lesbian, also speaks about her calling to become a traditional healer in South Africa. And within this, she frames her lesbian sexuality as something which is inspired and initiated by her male ancestral spirit. Right? So there are very different formations in terms of Black lesbian identification, which become legitimized through literature as well. In the second chapter of my dissertation, I also focus on a novel titled The Writing Circle, which focuses on particularly on specific rape myths in South Africa, but also the individual narration of sexual violence by 5 women in the novel. And this is something which has rarely been explored in South African literature, where a discursive mechanism is used that women are actually enabled to speak about the sexual violence in their lives. It also gives it also gives insight into the fact that although women in South Africa are constantly living in a way that seems to suggest that rape is something which is perpetrated by a stranger, the intimate violence and the sexual violence and rape which happens is often within the family context, or something which happens by somebody who is known. And so the silences that exist around this, and the silence, and the novel also explores the way in which silences reproduce these specific types of gender inequalities and don't allow the theme of rape to actually be addressed in the country. And then the final chapter of my dissertation looks at the very, very important work of a visual activist known as Zandile Moholi. And Moholi has produced 2 collections of photography. The first collection of photography that she produced was Only Half the Picture, was the title of the collection. And the series which I focus on in Only Half the Picture is titled the Hate Crime Series, which focuses specifically on corrective rape and homophobia and the representation of Black lesbian women bodies, both historically and the way in which this influences contemporary representations of Black sexuality, and Black female sexuality. So, for instance, the way in which the Black female body was often defined as deviant or grotesque or unnatural, and how this continues to influence the certain stereotypes which attach themselves to Black female bodies. And in the second collection, Moholi has documented 258 black and white portraits of women staring back and returning the gaze in each portrait in this collection of hers. These portraits in the collection is titled Faces and Phases 2006 to 2014. So whereas we see more of a focus on hate crime and corrective rape and negative representations attaching themselves to Black female sexuality in the hate crime series, we see something more positive in her second collection. And so these black and white portraits are also accompanied by statements, narratives, poems, and biographies. And I use both a visual and a discourse analysis to look at the way in which Black lesbian women are defining new forms of belonging in a nation which has actually represented them as falling outside the normative representations of citizenship. Her collection also includes women who have already been murdered because of their sexuality. So it includes them as part of this community, but it also mourns their loss. So I look at the theme of mourning, and I discuss Moholi's collection, and I define it as a positive counter-public. And many scholars have also defined Moholi's series of photographs as a queer archive. So whereas there are no queer archives on the African continent, this focus on looking at their biographies, living close to loss, but actually making statements, narratives, poems, and biographies the central component of this collection and this archive, defines a new form of belonging for the LGBT community in South Africa and beyond. So that just gives you more or less an idea or perspective of what the project is in totality. Yeah. Okay, thank you.
Questions, reflections?
Uncertainties.
So horrible that it's such a number.
Yeah.
Of victims.
Yeah, that was something interesting as well in terms of the Luleki Sizwe campaign with Mundumi Funda. She organized she approached the online campaign change.org to get international and national signatures on signing this petition to really draw attention to the problem of corrective rape in South Africa. And one of the contradictions of what happened over there is that when it started to gain international attention, it was once again defined as a Western problem. So that was it. Although it started to be recognized, it was once again defined as something as un-African, or as interest interest is only gained because this is a Western concern. Scholars have also written about how online campaigns like this can be problematic in drawing attention because they sometimes conflate or inflate the numbers of people who are being victimized because of corrective rape. And the lack of a recording mechanism makes it very difficult to state that 510 women have, for instance, been the victims of corrective rape per year. And it's difficult to define when this started to become a problem as well. For instance, the activist that I mentioned earlier, Funeka Soldat, speaks about being the victim of corrective rape in 1994 already, whereas the first actual reporting of this comes into the public sphere only in 2003. So it's also problematic in terms of using the term corrective rape, and many feminists have, feminists and gender scholars have troubled using this term but for the purposes of defining what has actually been happening, it has been one of the more convenient terms to use, so to say. But it's very important to recognize that the definition thereof is part of the problem as well. So, I mean, for instance, a lot of the statements that are reported on in the newspaper articles have focused on statements that say, I will show you what it feels like to be a real woman. You know, these are the types of the disciplinary discursive mechanisms that go along with the corrective rape punishment. And Zanele Moholi writes a very good article on corrective rape, which, if I remember correctly, was published in 2004. And she writes about the fact that a young lesbian woman, who also features in her photographic collection, made contact with her after being the victim of a corrective rape. And the struggle it is for this woman to actually get help in Johannesburg. And so this is why it's really important to understand the political context, the political background of South Africa as well, in terms of the geographical divisions that took place during the apartheid years also. So prior to 1994, during apartheid, heterosexual relationships were really central to defining or to upholding the idea of segregation in the country. And so homosexuality very seldom featured. Of the first activism which we see is in the 1980s, with organizations such as GLOW, Gays and Lesbians of Witwatersrand, and then we also get another organization called Olga, which was the organization of lesbians and gays that was in Cape Town. And during the apartheid period, which already started in 1949 and continued until 1994, the non-white community was literally displaced. So the townships which I speak of are areas which fall outside of the metropolitan areas in South Africa. And if you drive through South Africa today, you can still very visibly see remnants of the apartheid years. So underdeveloped, poor township areas are places where there is often a lot of violence, and so the manifestations of this is often happening in these areas as well. But it's important to recognize that the women in these communities don't have the resources that a white lesbian woman would have, for instance, if she were to be a victim of corrective rape. This woman who contacted Zanele Moholi, she first had to get local transport, a taxi from the township where she lived to Johannesburg. She then would have to go to a state hospital, which is largely under-resourced, reporting the crime at the police station. Secondary victimization took place there. Secondary victimization took place during the examination of the rape. And so it's really important to see the more rooted and multiple forms of oppression which take place against women who become marginalized not only because of their sexuality, but also because of their race, their class, their socio-economic background, and a very long history of representation which hasn't allowed black lesbian women to visibly represent themselves as homosexual. So there are numerous challenges which face them. Yeah, but the statistics are, I mean, in terms of the rape statistics, that is truly shocking for me, that you know, that it has become so prevalent in South Africa. And this is also one of the reasons I find Phumla Dineo Khola's book on rape particularly interesting, because Phumla argues that rape is so prevalent in South Africa because it has become acceptable. And when she starts writing her book, she writes about the fact that something that struck her when she was reading, you know, when she was watching a documentary on rape, was that these men were being interviewed about rape. And they were speaking really brazenly and openly about the fact that they raped women, and this is something which is, you know, basically acceptable to do. It's an acceptable thing. If they, you know, they had raped women in the past, but if they went to prison, they had learned their lesson, but they might rape a woman in the future again. And then the journalist that was interviewing them said, what would you do if somebody raped a close family member of yours? And all of a sudden there was a very different reaction to what rape actually is, and to how this can be harmful for somebody. And so the insight which Phumla speaks about there is that while it's defined as acceptable, and these men are unaccountable to some, what the broader conceptualization around this is that gender inequality is so rife in South Africa that it becomes, in a sense, acceptable to rape. It doesn't, however, mean that these men don't know that what they are doing is wrong. And one cannot be at that point. Phumla writes, for instance, if the theory that those who hurt, those who are hurt others is true, then we would see large groups of queer people hurting other people. And this is not the fact in society. We see something very different. And this is directly related to patriarchal relations, where women are defined as there for the consumption of men. And it's these types of beliefs and these types of structural knowledges that have to be challenged in South African society, and which have for a very long time not been addressed, because the focus, and I think partly because the focus for a long time has been on race and racial politics in South Africa. That is something quite different between South Africa and Sweden. Whereas in South Africa, we have become more accustomed to speaking about race and racial politics. Sweden has been the opposite in terms of speaking about gender, sexuality, same-sex, rights for same-sex couples. And I think that it can make for an interesting debate on how certain people are held accountable. In Sweden, you are held accountable to a certain degree not to infringe on the rights of somebody else because of their sexual orientation. I'm not saying that this is always the case, but to a certain degree there is a sense of accountability. And this is something, these are debates which are only opening up now in South Africa and starting to be addressed. Yeah.
I have a question, but it's not specifically regarding corrective rape.
Yeah.
But I found it interesting what you said, that South Africa was the first, or one of the first countries who legalized same-sex marriage, as well as there was another law.
Yeah, there was a law that stipulated against discrimination based on sexual orientation. It was the first country in the world to do so.
Exactly, in 2006. And
In 1996.
oh, sorry,
Yeah.
in 1996. And I'm wondering, like, if you know how that came about.
Yeah, that's. I mean, during, as I was saying earlier, there was some activism that started during the 1980s with the LGBT organizations coming together. And the organizations that I mentioned, GLOW and OLGA, and 43 other organizations during this time, eventually formed a coalition, which was known as the National Coalition of Gay and Lesbian Equality. And the National Coalition of Gay and Lesbian Equality had very good ties with the current ruling party, the African, through the United Democratic Front, which was affiliated with the African National Congress. And there's somebody by the name of Richard Ryan Thorson, who writes an interesting article on how the rights of the LGBT community were carried over or carried through from the apartheid years into post-apartheid South Africa. And basically what Thorson argues is the fact that because of a group of lobbyists and campaigners and a group of, he speaks of a group of white attorneys and a group of black activists who were instrumental in forming the National Coalition of Gay and Lesbian Equality. And their strong ties with lawmakers who were instrumental to writing up the Constitution. The rights of sexual minorities were taken very serious in the post-apartheid regime. And one of the things which they achieved during this period was the fact that they defined sexuality in the same way that they defined race. Almost, he speaks of it as an immutable characteristic. And so one of the very strong stances of the African National Congress was that discrimination should never happen again in the same way that it happened with racial politics during the apartheid years. And so by defining sexual identity as a characteristic, not as some type of sexual preference, by defining it in the same way as race, and race already being so strongly embedded in the South African psyche, it became, it wasn't challenged when lawmakers brought it into the Constitution. So, for instance, there was one of the advisors in this regard was L.B. Sachs, and he said that it's really important to speak about sexual identity and how it's important not to discriminate. Nobody should fall outside of the Constitution. And so even if some people were not convinced in terms of same-sex relationships or were not in agreement with homosexual relationships because they wanted to hold the law and the Constitution so strong against discrimination based on race, they had to do the same with sexual identity, and so that was one of the primary ways in which a transition from the pre-democratic period over. So it's quite an interesting component which he speaks about in terms of why it was considered so important. So what we see, for instance, is that people continue to agree that we need to have a progressive legislation around these issues. If we're not going to hark back to the past, we have to emphasize that discrimination on all levels will not happen again. But while these decisions were being made at a constitutional level, social attitudes in communities that had not received very many privileges during the apartheid years. People who had not been educated, and this is an important component, for instance, for an organization like RFSU, people who do not have not been educated in terms of issues around LGBTQ rights, sexual education. HIV and AIDS was another issue which emerged as a major problem, reinforcing a negative stereotype around sexuality in South Africa in the post-apartheid years. And so it really was essential to include that in the Constitution and not hark back to something which might put the country in a situation. So social attitudes were much slower to transform than the legislative legislative changes. And if you look at the legislative changes, I mean, they've been challenged in so many ways. Basically the Constitution stipulating against discrimination based on sexual orientation, the possibility to marry, same-sex marriages are accepted, the possibility to adopt, laws around artificial insemination and reproduction. These are all at a standard which meets that of a progressive country like Sweden, but the education and the societal views and perspectives are a far cry from where it actually needs to be. Yeah.
Would you say like this discourse at that time, when that legislation happened, was the same or very different? Like, has it changed since the rape started come about?
Yeah, that's an interesting and a very important question as well. I think, and it's something which Nadine Lake speaks about in her book. I think at the time that these legislative changes were being made, there was really an atmosphere and an attitude of hope that things in South Africa were about to change on so many levels. And a large part of that, for instance, one of the prominent figures during this time was a religious figure, Archbishop Desmond Tutu, who also speaks about the Rainbow Nation. And so there were all of these aspirations and a type of aspirational ideology for what South Africa is about to become. And we see positive developments in terms of the activists as well as activist organizations. But I think, and I agree with Nadine Lake in this way, in that she states a very big setback after this period was in 2006 with the rape trial of Jacob Zuma. And that was really a deciding point in terms of, and these types of events which happen are very important in terms of forming a democracy. South Africa is now only a 22-year-old democracy. And in terms of the decision that was made at that period in time, that Jacob Zuma, I mean, one cannot say, did he not rape Kwezi? One doesn't know. But, the evidence suggests that he did. And for people to consistently side with men who get away with acts of sexual violence and rape, it does send out a message that you can perpetrate and act with impunity. So, for instance, something really important in the newspaper text that we see is that while the black lesbian woman remains silent and while they're represented as without agency, the perpetrators of corrective rape often appear without remorse and that they act with impunity. There's no responsibility really taken. And I think it was, I'm speaking under correction, but for instance, with the rape and murder of Yudi Simelane, one of the perpetrators and they reported on this, is that he said, well, I'm not sorry. You know, that there's really this idea that what I did wasn't wrong, and I can continue to do that without paying any, or without being held accountable for it. And so that is important in terms of the way in which sexual violence has become acceptable. And I think it was a watershed moment when they decided that Jacob Zuma, a man who has possibly raped a woman, continues to become the president of the country. And while he had something like 983 cases of corruption against his name, he continued to become the leader of the country. Those types of issues are very important in terms of messages which are sent to a country around accountability, and they are critical moments which have lasting effects. Yeah. But you know, I mean, I don't think that it's reason to give up. There are still many organizations which are very active in accommodating, not accommodating, but really addressing issues around sexual violence, addressing issues around rape, helping asylum seekers, people coming into the countries who are being victimized because of their sexuality. And these are the issues that are often not reported on. So we often see the representation of these men who act without remorse or appear without remorse, but we often don't see the positive strides that are made. And it's perhaps more important to focus on what is being done. So for instance, this week, there's been a minister, a religious minister, I think he's from the United States, who has been wanting to come to Africa and to South Africa to basically to spread homophobic views. And one often sees this type of movement of, Western religious leaders coming into Africa and speaking about how it's essentially good to be heterosexual, and this reproduction of an idea of Christianity and heterosexuality. And the decision was made this week by the Department of Home Affairs that they will not allow this minister to come into South Africa. So for me, that's a positive decision that was made. But it's really, there's a failure on the part of many other systems as well. There's a failure on the part of the police personnel that are not educated on rape, on homosexuality, and don't know how to address the issues as well. Which, is really central to a failure of addressing homophobic violence in South Africa.
So is there any reports of corrective rape in the white community at all?
From what I haven't found any. Most of the majority of the reports, the majority of the reports has been directed against black women and mixed race women, and one doesn't. And there's really a large silence in terms of this. I think that this, while some of the research around this and the statistics was that while 44% of the lesbian community report that they may be affected by hate speech or some type of hate crime, not corrective rape, 86% of the black lesbian community experience homophobic violence, but much more of a more prominent backlash in terms of corrective rape other violations. And it seems that this notion that homosexuality is un-African seems to legitimize the idea that it is okay to discipline or to correct lesbian sexuality within the African community. Some of the documentaries, for instance, as well, if you look at Zanele Moholi has also made has also produced a documentary on corrective rape, and there have been others who have also focused on the issue. And for instance, one of the black men that they interview about this says, if a black woman identifies as lesbian, I won't rape her myself, but it's fine with me if other men show her the way. And then he carries on to say, but yeah, lesbianism, that's maybe okay in the white community because this is something that comes from whites. So that idea seems to have, even though it doesn't have any legitimate claim to be made. I mean, homosexuality within the African community has been documented as far back as the 17th century. So it's really not a legitimate claim to make. Actually, there have always been examples of same-sex relations, maybe spoken about in a different way, but or using a different language to speak about same-sex relations. But this idea of sexual identity, which troubles the notion of the African family, or a woman's relation, or women being defined in relation to men in African families, is highly problematic. And this is something which I think needs more research as well. And yeah, I think it definitely needs further investigation. Yeah. Any other questions? So if there's any motivation to continue education as far as sexuality is concerned, this is truly important. That Sweden has done very important work, I think, in this regard, and it calls for more in terms of speaking about sexuality, something which was considered really taboo during the apartheid years. And I remember, some of you may know the South African actress Charlize Theron, and so Charlize, shortly during the 2000s, I think it was one of the first advertisements which came out during the post-apartheid years, and Charlize Theron comes onto the screen and basically says, have you ever raped a woman? Stand up, or she directly addresses the issue of rape, and that was immediately shut down in South Africa. It was many men complained about the advert, saying that how can you accuse us of rape? We've never raped a woman, and all of these negative comments came flooding in, and it's really just shown how during a time where sexuality was really a taboo matter, and how it was so strictly spoken of in terms of heterosexuality, coming to terms of speaking about other sexualities in South Africa has been a very big challenge. And maybe I think it's important to directly address people on this level as well, which has not proved very successful so far.
Do you think it was a bit sensitive in the regards that she was white?
Yes,
as well.
Yes, it could have been that as well, and so, for instance, with our previous president, Thabo Mbeki, there's an article which is written by a woman called Helen Moffat. She writes about rape in post-apartheid South Africa. even before. And Thabo Mbeki was really agitated by a woman called Charlene Smith, who also spoke about her own rape. And Thabo Mbeki said that she keeps on speaking about rape as if it's only perpetrated by black men. And this has become part of the problem of the debate, is that as soon as, for instance, with the Jacob Zuma rape trial, some of the arguments state that it was so important not to see another black man as the stereotypical rapist. And this was an image which became so embedded and so strong during the apartheid years, was that, you know, stereotypically white women were seen as most vulnerable. And the worst type of violation would be the rape of a white woman by a black man. And it was also really essential to upholding the segregation policies and politics. And so in terms of that, the black community obviously doesn't want to reinforce a stereotype of characterizing the black community as a stereotypical rapist. And I think that this is quite important in terms of my literary representations as well, because this novel, which I include in my dissertation, The Writing Circle, begins with a rape scene. And the rape scene which ensues, the woman, right at the beginning of the novel, her race is not made explicit. But the rest of the 5 female characters, they are, and I mean, South Africa is a multiracial country. You know, there are people from various racial backgrounds. And so the book focuses on speaking about the intersections of race and sexuality, but also challenging this idea of the rape myth, of rape being perpetrated by a stranger in the first place. And it also addresses the issue that rape is very common within white communities as well. It may be a family member or just, you know, it's usually somebody that is known. And that has been proved in the research as well. And so it's really, it's an interesting perspective, because in this novel, which has been written by a woman, her name is Rosina Mart, at the beginning of the novel, one assumes that the woman is white, but that's not explicitly addressed. And it really goes into detail of how basically she arrives at home. She's part of a writing circle. And this writing circle focuses on sharing stories of sexual violence and looking at each other's writing in the group. And Isabel, the woman who arrives at the house, the rest of the women are sitting inside but don't hear her arrive at the gate. As she stops at the gate, and in South Africa, if you've ever been, you will know that people are very focused on safety. And so there's always some type of security mechanism. And so Isabel is about to open the remote controlled gate, and as she does this, a black man stops her and with a gun says, "Open the door, I'm getting in." And so he takes her to the back seat of the vehicle, and to the back seat, and he starts raping her. And it really details how she's defined in relation to this man, how she completely becomes an object. And she actually, in a sense, she kind of she speaks about how she leaves her body and she can see herself. She looks back onto herself, the actions which are happening against her. She's completely out of control, and she looks back upon herself. And so I look, you know, she's described as a complete object in relation to this. Later on in the novel, we see a rape, the representation of a rape of a young black woman. She's about to apply to study at the University of Cape Town. An older white man says that he's helped the family traditionally for a long period of time, and he says he will drive her to the university. And they stop on the way, and he said, and he tells her to get out of the car, and he says, don't worry, you know, consider this a learning experience. And he rapes her, and none of the detail that is given in the initial rape scene, which I just spoke about, is alluded to in this rape. So she's raped, she gets dropped off at the University of Cape Town, she goes and presents her artworks because she wants to be considered for the art school. And what's interesting about the difference between the definitions of these rapes is how the trauma, which is defined around, let's say, for instance, the white woman in the initial rape scene, and the bodily and psychological trauma that she experienced, none of that is made specific around the black woman who is raped. And it says a lot about, in terms of which bodies become considered more grievable, which bodies are considered more intelligible, which are more precarious. And I think that this has become quite common reproduction of knowledge in South Africa, is that if a white woman has been raped, it will be taken very seriously. If a black woman is raped, it's almost considered as normative. And that you just need to keep on living because this is part of society. And so in terms of, and Judith Butler writes quite extensively around this, about, you know, which bodies become intelligible in society. And these are often the rationalizations around war as well. Which bodies are considered easy to dispose of? The same types of rationalizations around war, for instance, can also be extrapolated to sexual violence. Which bodies are okay to rape? Why am I, as a white woman, fearful of rape in South Africa, whereas a white man wouldn't? What is regarded acceptable to do to certain bodies? And I think that's very important in terms of theoretically thinking about, you know, recognizability, apprehension, intelligibility of bodies. And I'd really recommend you reading some of the chapters of Judith Butler's book titled Frames of War, if that topic interests you. Yeah.
Is there any discussion about raped men?
There is some, but it's really in the minority. There have been some cases of corrective rape as well, but some of the research around this says that even if men, that firstly the men that are raped is also because of gender non-conformity. So usually men who identify as more feminine, so to discipline that type of sexuality, or trans women, for example. But they say that men are even less likely to report the crimes at the police. So whereas it may be unacceptable to report the crime for, you know, where you might receive a secondary victimization as a black lesbian woman, it may even be more difficult for black men or other men to report. And yeah, I mean, I think in terms of, I'm speaking about a specific community here, but there's been even less research done in terms of the white community. How much sexual violence happens there, how many silences exist around that. And I haven't particularly focused on that. That is also an important focus. So yeah, out of all of the cases that I looked at, there was only one mention of corrective rape happening to a man, And it was really like a scant reference that was made to him. It wasn't much detail that was made.
Thank you, Nadine. I really get the impression you're so knowledgeable on this topic that keep on talking much longer. But I think it would be really, because you mentioned a lot of references that you said were interesting, like group and rape and some other, and maybe it would be possible to get a list from you, and then I can share with all of you.
Definitely.
Then we can further. And of course, also to share your thesis once it's done.
Yes, once it's completed, I've been invited back. I'm leaving for South Africa the last day of this month, and then I've been invited back for a SLUT seminarium on the 3rd of November. So I will be back for a week then, and I will submit my dissertation, if all goes well, in January next year. So I can definitely share the work that I've done with you as well. It may be interesting for some insights and perspectives.
Obviously, in Sweden, a lot of people are interested in issues like this, but how is it in South Africa? Like you studying and working with this, like what is the general attitude that there's an interest in these kind of issues?
Yeah, I think that in South Africa that's also a very good question, is that a lot of the debates and the discussions that take place happen within often academic circles, people who are working with gender and women's studies, people who are specifically working with sexual violence, domestic violence, and that the reaction when I've spoken about my research has often been a negative one in South Africa. People would be, why would you want to research something like that? There is a reluctance to speak about these issues, and there is a preference to remain silent, because I think that there's a recognition that knowing that to speak about it means that there's a certain level of work that needs to be done personally as well, and that it does upset a specific structure of sexual and gender inequality, which has become very much normative in society. And obviously men who have for a very long time held on to certain levels of privilege and power, and who have who speak about women in disparaging or negative or sexist ways, are often not even by women often addressed on that. So, one of the big problems for me is that, the word feminism, for example, has almost become like a curse word in certain societies. So many people don't feel comfortable with what it means to be a feminist, or, I can understand within the debate that feminism can be exclusionary for some, but in terms of the broader debate, feminism has had very important, results in addressing gender inequality in countries worldwide. So, I think that it's really important that one needs to break those silences, and that people need to become more willing as well to speak about the intersection between race and sexuality also. I think that there are often these types of, and this is still very much prevalent in South Africa, is that although we all live together in one country, there's often a lack of interaction between people from poor communities and more privileged communities, and almost a sense of a blindness around what are the lived realities for people who are actually our neighbors, you know, but who continue to be discriminated against. And these are social inequalities that haven't been addressed, not within public discourses, not within recognizing the problem in South Africa by individuals, and also not by the current government, not focusing on really addressing socio-economic and gender inequalities there. So, yeah, I mean, for me, it's been a much easier platform, I think, in a sense, to speak about this in Sweden. And but I think that has been a very positive thing for me in terms of actually becoming comfortable to talk about matters like that you can take it back with you as well, and you can and really consider the value in speaking about the issues also. Mm. Yeah.
Okay, well, thank you so much for coming.
Thank you, and thank you to everybody who came tonight as well. Yeah.
And if there's someone here who is not in the Facebook group and wants to join,
I don't think I would
Yeah.
like to join.
I need to, I will add you. Just write down your name and then.
So you can learn also, or just for this.
We have a known group. What's that? Forskar.